Okay, so we have another video that I'm doing, and this was by request, and it's about Teresa of Avila's interior castle. And the reason that I'm doing a video on that, it's not that we follow her methodology in any kind of a strict way. At the center, we don't, but she is an incredible saint. I'll tell you a little bit about her before we get started, but she's an incredible saint who achieved a very, very intense and powerful level of enlightenment. And she was asked by her superiors to write down sort of what had happened to her and the levels she had experienced. And when she didn't want to do that, she didn't want to write any of it, but when she prayed about what to say, she was given a vision from Jesus about the soul being like a crystal palace or castle or mansion with seven levels to it. And in the center dwells Jesus Christ, and his light illuminates the whole place, but he dwells in the very center. And she saw that they were, and she wrote this book from a place of union. She was in union when she wrote the book. So she had attained the highest level of enlightenment you can attain. And she was writing about the journey from that perspective of being all the way awake and also being the superior, the nun for her convent. So she was also in charge of, or under, a lot of the nuns' spiritual lives were under her care. And she reformed the whole Carmelite order and kind of returned it to a deep contemplative experience. So she just was a very influential and powerful woman. And she didn't want to write anything, about it. She didn't want to do the work of writing it, but she was asked or really told to by her superiors, and she had to do it. So she did. And she was given that vision of the 7 stages. And so what I wanted to do in this video, I said I might go really in depth, and I may do that. It depends on if people request. I'll do it if I'm asked to do more. But what I thought would have been helpful to me in the beginning, more than anything, is just a clear, concise overview of all the stages from 1 to 7. Because one of the dangers of reading Teresa of Avila is she gets into the weeds, and they think she might have been ADD. She gets off track a lot into sidetracks. And so by the time you've read an entire level written by her, you're not always sure what the gist of that level was. She goes on tangents, sometimes related to other stages. And so people could sometimes leave her literature feeling confused. And so I've always benefited from just what is the basic gist of the 7 stages. And I think that's what I'm going to try to talk about today and see if that's useful for people. And so the first thing I want to say, just by way of backdrop, is she was a mystic. And I know that I've spoken about this in other videos, but it's such a foundational piece of understanding for spirituality that it's really good just to hear it again and again. And people that aren't mystical need to hear it. But also, maybe more importantly, people that are mystical need to hear it. So she was a mystic who achieved a very high level of enlightenment. But you can achieve just as high of a level of enlightenment and not be a mystic. And that's really, really important for people to know. If you're getting on this deep contemplative path, if you're entering the spiritual path, it's really important to understand that visions and voices from God and messages from God and experiencing blinding white lights or angelic visitations or levitation or, any of the sort of intense things that we associate with some of the saints, it's important to know that none of that is necessary. That you can... the best way to say it is just think that in a room of 4 people, 2 of them are mystics and 2 of them are not. If an angel enters the room powerfully, the 2 mystics might notice something. They might see that angel. If they don't see the angel, they might feel all of a sudden an overwhelming amount of God's power flow into the room, and they might experience that in their bodies and experience the changes that it's producing in them really directly. They might really notice or even see that light. Many times a mystic will see the light as it comes in the room. And the two non-mystics would not see any of that. And they might, if you cornered them, like let's say you were a mystic and you saw this light come in the room or an angel come and stand in the middle of everybody. If you were a mystic and you could see that, and you said to the non-mystic, who we're just assuming they're all equally devout in this case, okay? We're assuming that all of these people have an equal level of devotion. That isn't always the case. Sometimes the mystic has less devotion than the non-mystic. Sometimes it's reversed. People are individuals and there's a lot of variation. But let's just assume they're all equally sort of devoted and sincere about their relationship with God, and maybe even at similar stages of spirituality, just to make it all, to equalize all of that. Then if the mystic said, do you feel that? The non-mystic might say, maybe. They might say, well, a little. Like the mystic might say, do you feel the power in the room? Can you feel God's presence in the room? It is so strong. And the non-mystic might at that point pay a little more attention and notice that, yes, just a very subtle difference. They notice a subtle difference in the room. Or they might just say, well, I just feel peaceful. But they don't experience that power as directly in their senses. They don't notice it as much. And this is a really important distinction to make because, so there's a mystic seeing the angel come in the room, and there's a non-mystic who didn't see the angel come in the room. And the mystic feels all this power flowing through them, love or holiness or a sense of the sacred, and the non-mystic doesn't. And so from without training in spirituality, without an understanding of the contemplative path, one might be tempted to say that the mystic is experiencing more of God. And that would be false. That would be wrong. As it turns out, all of that experience, the angel coming in the room, the power that flowed into the room and flowed into the people that were present in the room, all of that is really, in the end, supposed to produce a result in the people. A transformation. Now, an encounter like that might not produce a noticeable, like a really direct black and white, it was this way before and it's this way after. It might not be like that at all. It might be a regular thing that happens where the person is just fed with spiritual power kind of on a regular basis and they're slowly changing. But the only test in authentic spirituality, for spirituality, is really our state of being and our behavior and attitude, generally speaking, throughout our lives. And so the mystic saw the angel, the non-mystic didn't see the angel, but both of them over time have an increasingly loving, forgiving, peaceful, calm, joyous attitude in life. So both of them are experiencing the results of that power touching them, but only one group is noticing it directly. And as far as I'm concerned, this is just personality types. This has nothing to do with spiritual advancement. It has nothing to do with being gifted. In fact, mystics sometimes fail more than non-mystics due to their heightened sensitivity. They can be misled easy. They can have false mystical experiences that can lead them astray. And they can also get caught up in their sensitive nature and confuse egoic impulses for spiritual impulses. And I wrote a note on stage 3. So in the interior castle, it's 7 stages. And the first and second stage, well, the second stage is sort of like what we call the night, the night of the senses. And it's this deep period of purification. And if someone emerges out of that deep period of purification, they're in stage 3. And they used to be so egoic and so filled with pride or just so worldly. And sometimes they had grievous sins they were involved in. And they went through a really deep transformation, which we'll talk about. And they've come out the other side, and they're very different. And Teresa of Avila says these people are very egoic still, very deeply embedded in ego. And that it is really often the case that they make the mistake they made before the night. Before the night, they thought they were talking directly to God. And when God gave them a dream or an intuition, it was God talking to them, possibly if they're mystical. Then they go through the night and they find out most of that was untrue. Most of that was a lie. And they come out and they say, okay, now I'm more clear. I can hear better. And so what St. Teresa of Avila says about people in the third stage is that they canonize their feelings and intuitions. And canonize just means like the divine seal of approval. So they go on to make the same mistakes they made before. They have a little dream, they have a little vision, they have an intuition, and they think that's true. They think that's God talking to them. And they go on to make many mistakes. If they're not careful, if they're not very careful, they go on to make the same mistakes they made before at just a different level. And so you can see that there's this progression that happens. There's a purification that happens over time. So the mystics, though, they're more prone to that because their sensitive nature tends to conflate imaginations and feelings with talking to God. Sometimes it feels similar. Sometimes it feels the same, even when it is only imagination, or it could be the devil. And so the sensitive mystic types can sometimes get off track in ways that the non-sensitive, non-mystical types do not. The non-mystical types can sometimes be, not always, but sometimes be more steady, more sure, and more steadfast on the spiritual path than the mystical type can be. Mystical types are going to make more mistakes in this way, and they do hear from God. I mean, they do notice God. But at third stage, there's a lot of ego left, and they notice sometimes things that are egoic are given the divine stamp of approval. And so a lot of trouble can still lie in wait at that stage for a mystical type. And the journey is not sure at third stage. People get off track all the time. And so just a lot of carefulness is needed. So I wanted that just to be the background. Non-mystics and mystics. St. Teresa was a mystic. And in the past, when I've done summary classes on Teresa of Avila, I've really emphasized the mystical experiences, and I'm not going to this time. And I hope that's not a disappointment to anybody who, I know this was requested, and this video was requested. I hope that's not a disappointment. What I thought is I might come back and do another video afterwards that talks about more of the mystical experiences, but I'm not as keen to do that these days, and the reason why is because just with time and experience, you come to see that a lot of people aren't mystics. And so when you say, this is what happens in the fifth stage, right? This is what happens in the sixth stage. If you define the fifth stage and the sixth stage by the mystical experiences that happen to mystics in those stages, rather than defining those stages by the change that happens in the soul in those stages, you can tend to make people misunderstand and have them looking in the wrong direction. So following this mystic, non-mystic, power comes in the room. Both groups are changed equally by that power, but the mystic notices all this fancy stuff while it happens. The non-mystic doesn't, but both change the same way as a result of that encounter with power, even if the non-mystic didn't notice the power itself, or barely noticed it, or only noticed it a little. So going with that sort of backdrop, let's look at Teresa's 7 stages from that perspective, from the perspective of really what change happens to a soul in each stage. What are the changes that happen? And then maybe later we'll go back and talk. I might mention a little bit of what happens to people, but it isn't that important. And over time, I've grown less impressed by it all because I see mystics that I know and work with struggle in areas that some non-mystics I know don't struggle at all in. And so I just have come to really understand that a mystical encounter, while it's wonderful, I mean, we want, it increases faith and it increases faith in the community. And there's a lot of good in it that we wouldn't want to say it's no good. That's wrong completely. But we just want to say, look, we know what enlightenment is like, and we know what kind of characteristics people in these different stages are like. We know what they're like. And that's what it boils down to, and it only boils down to that. And it has been said, I know Thomas Keating said it, and I've read it endlessly. It is not required to have mystical experiences in the Christian tradition. It isn't. And I've read about this in a number of other traditions you would expect to be mystical. And when you look deeply, they don't require mystical experiences. They require certain characteristics, certain fundamental changes in the soul. That's what's required, and that's how they know you're at a certain level. And a mystical experience, it isn't even necessary to get to those levels. So let's look at it from that perspective. Let's look at Teresa of Avila's interior castle, just a broad overview, like another 40 minutes of speaking, and that's all. Just a general overview of what are these stages like. And then I think that would give someone new on the path a little clarity on what to expect and what to think about the path. And so let's talk about stage one. So stage one for Teresa of Avila is someone who has just decided to enter the spiritual path. And they may not yet be practicing regular daily prayer and meditation. So a lot of people are in stage one who got there not by spending a lot of time in prayer, but just by deciding that at some moment in their life, sometimes it's tragedy, sometimes it's success and finding an emptiness at the end of success. More than one person I've spoken to has found everything they ever wanted and then found it didn't make them happy. And so sometimes it's great tragedy and loss, and sometimes it's success, and there's many other ways it can come about. But at some point for stage one, the person decides that I want to live a more spiritual life. And they're filled with the world, though. I mean, they're primarily worldly people. And this is important, too, when we talk about sin. Sin's a strange concept, because if you say these people, my temptation was to say, these people are really wrapped up in sin. But then I know a whole group of people that are really wrapped up in sin won't think that's them. And I don't want to let them slip that way. Not to be mean to them, but we're trying to help people. So if someone's watching and you say, these people are really wrapped up in sin, they might have deep pornography, right? They might be dishonest with money. They might be thieves, right? They might be burglars, right? They might be totally just lost in laziness and unwilling to work. Then there's a whole group of people that are really in stage one that would look down at that and say, well, yeah, that's not me. I must clearly be further along. So that's no good. We don't want that. So it is possible to have a master's degree or a PhD, be living up on the hill, making $300,000 a year and be in stage one, and live an ordered life, a well-disciplined life, and you can still be in stage one. Well, how is that possible? Well, it comes down to what is motivating that person. See, for Christianity, it's not enough not to sin, and you're not fully condemned if you do sin. I mean, we don't take sin lightly, but for Christianity, there's one thing. Have you this new life that is dwelling inside of you and living inside of you, Christ, the life of Christ? Do you have grace living inside of you? And is it sanctifying you in this way that makes you spiritual? And you can be highly successful and refined and educated and cultured and have none of that in you. Be completely missing it. Just as you could be a robber or a burglar on the other end of it and have none of it living in you. And both of those groups could be at stage one. So stage one really has to be defined by the person has decided that they want to have some kind of spirituality. Or it might be more appropriate to say they sometimes think about that. They're not dead serious about it yet, but they sometimes think how they'd like to walk a deeper spiritual path. That's stage one. And Teresa of Avila described that as living with reptiles and snakes and poisonous things. And, that those are your companions. That's who you live with. And that's really, essentially that's stage one. But they've decided to they've decided to walk a spiritual path. And I don't know the numbers for this, but we do know that a certain percentage of people, when they decide to walk a spiritual path, are immediately flooded with power. They're probably the mystical types, and then only some of them. But they're immediately flooded with power. And so one of the things Teresa says that I think is very interesting is that people in stage one who are at the absolute beginning of the path and just friends with demons and reptiles, right? Just a mess on the spiritual level. If they're mystical types and they have one of those kind of quick awakenings that are really common, some people awaken really slow and gradually over time, and some people awaken very quickly. If they're one of those people that's had a quick, instantaneous conversion, then people in stage one, for a period of time, may well have access to all 7 stages. They might be having visions. They might levitate. They might be experiencing union with God sometimes. And this is just how God treats a certain segment of the population in God's perfect wisdom, knowing what would best bring them into union. And that can go on for a while. And in my criticism sometimes of certain spiritual paths that I was involved in before I found what I think are more legitimate spiritual paths, are that some of those paths really teach you how to extend your stay in stage one and really manipulate mystical experiences and sort of fabricate them. It's really common today with the use of psychedelics. It's extremely common that someone is in stage one and they're taking tons of psychedelics and they're having experiences that are more likely associated with 4, 5, 6, and 7. But they're in stage one, and that's really common. But there are other ways. There's breathing practices, and there's all kinds of things you can do to sort of cling and sort of recreate what God has done in your soul. But that's not really the point. I mean, Teresa of Avila says just let them have that time they're in that stage, but don't make them shorten it, but also don't have them extend it. Just let it play out. God is getting their attention in a powerful way. And when they're ready to deepen their path and walk more deeply, they'll enter the second dwelling places of the castle. So that's stage one. And so it can look like just someone barely interested who just said, yeah, I think I'm maybe getting to a place now where I'd like to be more devoted to spirituality. From that, almost lukewarm looking thing all the way to somebody who is getting nailed by God's power in very intense ways. And both of those people are in stage one. But God knows how to draw each type in, mystic or non-mystic or anything in between. God knows just how to draw us in and what we need to keep us coming. And so that's stage one, mostly friends with the ego, mostly friends with sin, mostly friends with character defects, right? And very worldly. And then as they progress, but this person now, they've invited God in to some degree, right? They've said, I want God in my life. So now all of a sudden God's power is dwelling in them. And it's drawing them. It's beckoning them to come deeper. And, and I've seen people spend, just as an example, I've seen people spend 5, 6 years in that stage. Definitely wanting, they're the ones who come to meditation once a year and they say they really want to come to meditation, but they're busy. They really want to, but they just have so much going on in their life they can't. And then a lot of them eventually do start coming. A lot of them eventually start spending time in prayer regularly in a serious way. But it just takes them a while to get to that place, which is totally fine. So that's stage one, essentially. And the main thing is it's not a deep commitment to God yet, but it's in the vicinity. These people are starting to think that's what they want to do. And if they had an initially powerful conversion, they might have had visions during that period or quite intense mystical experiences. It's really common, happens all the time. And that is not to be confused with, it often is, but it's not to be confused with actually being in stage 5, 6, or 7, which is a whole other thing. Okay, so and normally with good theology, that stage 1 might not last that long, but with certain methodologies that people have discovered, they can sort of extend the time they spend there. And if they don't have good theology and they're extending their time there, it increases the likelihood that they'll think they're further along than they are. And spiritual ego is built, a nefarious kind of spiritual ego that can lead to all kinds of really serious problems. The devil's really easily can influence a person there and whisper in their ear and appeal to their pride and appeal to their lust and appeal to their sense of importance and also reproduce mystical experiences that are blissful in the soul. So without good instruction in that stage, things can go really awry. They don't always, of course, but they can. And that really essentially is stage 1 as an overview. People just deciding to maybe get serious about spirituality. And then the second stage is a really, really big stage. It's really focused on by Teresa of Avila, and just in my experience, knowing people in spiritual communities, it's given a lot of attention because it's really the stage that separates the people who are likely to go all the way into union with God and the people who are not going to do so. The second stage is the one. Now, the third stage, Teresa of Avila has said it shouldn't even exist. It only exists because of human sin. And so we'll talk about what that means, but really what she's saying is, if someone is done the second stage, they ought to go right to stage 4, but they often stop at stage 3 and goof around and waste time. And I'll tell you what they wasted on. It's really interesting. But the second stage is where, I talk about it endlessly. In almost all my videos, I'm referencing it in one way or another. Because it's the one. It's the stage that decides whether someone is going to be serious on this path or not. And it's also a bit of a difficult stage because, when you're in stage 1, you're really not that sure if you're serious about God, but at some point you decide, I am serious and I'm going to go further. And you've matured a bit, obviously, or you wouldn't be able to say that. I'm going to meditate 20 minutes twice a day. I'm going to spend my time with God, and I'm going to give up these habits that I know are not healthy, but I'm doing them anyway. But you come up against that you can't let all that go, right? That you can't let your pride go, right? You come to discover in stage 2 that you are primarily operating from a space of ego, from a space of pride, from a space of fear, from a space of jealousy, from a space of envy. You're primarily coming from those places. And a person in stage 2 will I think it is certain that they will feel much worse off than they did in stage 1. In fact, Teresa says they're more secure, but they will feel less secure. And this is the whole, challenge of somebody in stage 2 is all of a sudden they've been floating along, feeling pretty good about themselves, maybe going to be a saint in a couple years, right? Maybe just 3 years, going to be enlightened. And this is really funny. One of the people I work with said that in the beginning she felt sorry for me because she kind of figured it'd be about 2 or 3 years before she was enlightened, and I'd been at it so long and I wasn't enlightened yet, and she kind of felt sorry for me. And we've really laughed about that because she is now in stage 2, and it's 7 years later. And it's just stage 1 is funny like that. We all think we're going to be so great sometimes in that stage. We have no idea what we're up against yet. And stage 2 is where you just become aware of what you're up against. You come up against your if you have a lot of this, you're suffering from your past. If you had a very difficult upbringing, that creates all kinds of warped disorder in the soul. And all of that has to be faced and processed through and discovered. And we've made deals in our will with our suffering, and we've been wounded by the world, and then we've chosen to harden our hearts towards others in order not to be harmed. And just think of all the different sort of psychological wounds and pains and complexes that we hear about. These have to be faced and overcome to some extent, to a really large degree. These have to be overcome in stage 2. And so it's a really tall order, and it can be difficult. And on top of that, people are attached to their looks, or they're attached to drama, or they're attached to, lust, or they're attached to money, or they're attached to popularity, and they're driven by these things, how they dress, how they act in public, maybe what job they take, where they choose to live. It's all so that they can impress people or fit in. It's not based on where's God sending me. It's all based on what will people think. And that's completely egoic behavior. It's 100% self-based and ego-based and sin-based. And so, people are completely driven by these motives almost all the time. And everyone I know on the path is astounded when they enter this stage to realize how every single thing they do is for the wrong reasons. And that's difficult to see. And that's what the second stage is about. And, John of the Cross calls it a night, and Teresa refers to it as a fog. And I've been lucky enough to witness a lot of people who've gone through that stage. It's really neat to see people who grow through those stages and get to those places beyond. And it's not an easy journey at all, because at first it's like you're afraid to see these dark things. Then you see one and you'll hope maybe that's the only really dark thing in there is to see. And then you see another thing. You think, well, I hope that's all. And then you see another. And sometimes you discover that they work together in ways that seem almost overwhelming, and you have no idea how you're going to become free of it. And this is wounding to the false self that we create in order to get by in this world. And this false self, it can't survive the spiritual path, so it has to just be crushed and dissolved and ground into powder. But how? How does it get ground into powder? Well, God just starts to show the soul that was a lie. Your entire motivation going into this room was to impress people. And why? And, you're jealous of everyone you meet who's prettier than you. You're always insecure around people that are more successful than you. You judge people who you think are lowly when you're just about at the same stage they are. Why don't you see that? So the Holy Spirit just begins to shine this power. This is the way I look at it. The Holy Spirit begins to shine a power on the soul that is kind of like twofold. On the one hand, it's enlightening the mind to see all of the darkness that is in them. And for some of us is long and arduous. For me, very difficult because I was, on top of having a lot of ego problems, I also had a really rough childhood with all kinds of pain to work through. And so that's just a lot to undo, and it can take a long time. And that's another thing, I didn't mention this, but it's important to know that this is going to sound so simple as I do a video on it. It's so simple, but you can expect to spend years in some of these stages. And I think some people's reaction will immediately be to want to be in a hurry. And I would just warn against that. I would try not to do that if you can, because there's not just a matter of getting through the stage. There's a matter of how much of that stage you absorbed. And so I would think the watchword would be thorough rather than quick. We want to be thorough, not quick. Sometimes a person wings through one of these stages because they didn't go very deeply into it. Now, ultimately, we leave all of this up to God, and I really mean that, because I don't know what's best for me. And heaven is a different thing than how enlightened I get on this planet. So if God wanted to quicken me up, get me to a certain stage so I could serve more, like get me into stage 4, and then I could serve more from that stage. Okay, great. I'm okay with that. If that's God's will, that's okay. But what I don't want to do is, through my own desires, egoic, selfish desires, rush through something or not fully cooperate with something that God would take me deeper into were I willing. So if it's a matter of I rush through and we're done in 2 years, or I let God really be thorough and it's 6.5 years, I want that 6.5 year path, because I know God has more wisdom about where I'm supposed to end up and the good I could do in the world if I end up there, but also, as importantly, the diminished harm that I will do in the world if I get to a deeper place. So we don't want to be the ones dictating how fast we go through, how deeply we go through. What we want to do is be really surrendered to God's will and say, your will be done. I don't know the way. And that, it turns out, to be the whole point of the second stage. The entire second stage, I think, there's a lot that goes on. There's deep psychological healing. There's deep healing from wounds from your past. There's a lot of self-knowledge. It's called the stage of self-knowledge. There's discovering what's making you tick and the sin in it. And there's good too, of course, but there's a lot of trouble. And seeing all of that just really bare without needing to flower it up and shine it up. And this is a really important thing, but what it's supposed to lead to is a deep knowing that you can't run your own life. And a surrender. Really what it comes down to is a humility. And it's a humility that's based on your experience with yourself, not your generosity. I always make that joke that the humility you find in the second stage is not humility. You've decided to be so generous and be humble. It's not that. The humility that comes in the second stage is you've looked at yourself for a number of years and found very, very good reason to have a low opinion of yourself. Not a low self-esteem, just a low opinion that, hey, I'm not special. I'm not that neat. There's nothing great about me. I'm not entitled to any level of enlightenment. All of this is God's will and it's not my business. And you mess up enough and you see yourself messing up enough, long enough to become deeply convinced of that fact, that you just don't know what you're doing and that you can't do anything that's truly good on your own. You just can't. You can go do the action. You can go give that $20 to the homeless person. You can do that. But you can't do that with any real love without God. You just can't. And so the second stage is a deep, deep cleansing and healing of all of that. And I just want to just say again, even though I've said it probably 3 times, it's a stage you don't want to rush through. You want to take your time. If you were somehow able to rush through, you might get sent back, or it might diminish how enlightened you could become in the upper stages. That would be tragic. So we want to give God our life. God knows how best to make the world better through us. God knows best how to bless our families through us. And God knows best how to treat us so that we end up in salvation and not up in some other place. And we have to trust that. And really, you can't get out of stage 2 until you do trust that to some level, to a good enough level to move on. And if you do move on, it's not because you started thinking positively, so that all of a sudden you were noticing only ego. And now you say, I'm done with that. Now I'm going to think positively. It's not that at all. You just start to see things more positively as that stage ends. So I hope that is a clear example of the second stage. And this one turns people away. A lot of people stay in stage 1 their whole life, kind of goofing around in spirituality and never going deep. And people I've known who have done that, who've then maybe years later come around and said, okay, I'm ready. They've all said, I just wasn't ready to do that work. That seemed a little hard. I wasn't ready to do it, so I ran away. And you know what? That's okay. I mean, that's totally fine. I mean, I would never suggest it. But if someone really isn't ready, they're not ready. So then they got to go until they're ready, and that's okay. So that's the second stage. We could talk now about the third stage, and I do have some notes. I just want to turn the page here so I don't miss it. So the person in the third stage has surrendered to God. Not fully, not even close, but it's enough that whatever stronghold that was clinging to that false identity, it's been weakened enough that that it doesn't need to be weakened more in this really intense sort of purifying way. I mean, it's almost like God shines a dark light on a person in that stage. And that dark light is in there just eroding at the false self. And it's tough. And it's got to happen until God is sure, reasonably sure, that if they let up and they start taking you into some other places, you won't go back to your old ways in a new form. And that's precisely what Teresa of Avila warns about in stage 3. So I thought I'd mention stage 3. Stage 3 is neat because you really did let go of some ego for real. And God has eased up on showing you it all the time. It's not that you won't see ego in yourself in later stages, because all the saints say you will. But it's almost like the foundation of it has crumbled. And there's still ego, but that real stronghold where you're identified with the false self has broken. And so you're in a different stage completely. And if you're in stage 3, I think I said this earlier, but I think she said somewhere, sort of paraphrased, this stage shouldn't exist. It should be 2 to 4, or 4 is the new 3. But it isn't. People hang out in stage 3, and the reason why is because their life gets really good. Happy marriage, happy friendships, enjoying your creativity or art or whatever, and none of these are bad things, by the way, just so you know. These are all good things. They're great to have. In a life that's going further to God, you can have these things. But that's what happens. The life becomes kind of full and blessed in some ways. And it's especially neat for people that were, that were deeply wounded. I know some people were raised in pretty good families, so they don't even know certain levels of darkness that many of us begin with, right? Our foundation, many of us, is really dark. And then we get up into stage 3, some people get up into stage 3 and it's like heaven to them. But nevertheless, lots of people that get to stage 3, they get lost in the good life God has given them because their attention was on God. So they started with a really egoic life. They had an awakening. They went through the long, sometimes 8-year purge in stage 2, and they've come out so different, and they're living the good life. They're living the good life with family and friends and whatever, maybe career, and for some people it's just now they can have a career because they were so sick they couldn't before, and it's so wonderful and everything's so neat. And then all of a sudden, the desire to go further, to continue pursuing God, can get put by the wayside. And those people can spend the rest of their lives. Teresa of Avila, in her day, felt like many people lived their whole lives at stage 3. And thinking they were pretty spiritual. And I think I've witnessed this. I think I've known many communities that have good examples of stage 3 people who think they're at stage 7. I mean, they might not know about stages, but they certainly think they found where it leads to. And they don't realize they're really getting barely started. In fact, the first 3 stages are called the purgative stages. Then the next stages are the illuminative stages. And so they're still in really the beginning, but they don't know, they haven't read the saints, they don't know there's so much further to go. So they get lost in stage 3. And, so she says, a person in stage 3 lives a well-ordered life. They make pretty good use of their time. They have pretty healthy relationships. One caveat, if you have deep, deep wounds from childhood, your stage 3 might not look as good as some people's stage 3. And I think it's just important to tell that, to just know that. If you started in a really good family, your stage 3 is going to look better than somebody that was just destroyed by their upbringing. That's just the way it is, and it's okay. But nevertheless, they're both in stage 3, and it's pretty good in there. It's better than it's ever been for both groups, and you get lost in there, and you're just hanging out, enjoying your life there, and your prayer and meditation time eases, slacks up a bit. You're missing your evening meditation maybe, right? So all of a sudden, the chances of going further are diminished because they're caught up in the good life. So that's the main danger. And then the other one I already mentioned, I'll just recap. People in stage 3 canonize their feelings as intuitions from God again, even though they knew better. But see, the thing is, they look back at how they did it before. They're not doing what they did before. So now they're sure they're right again. And this is a big problem with people in stage 3. Teresa talks about it. The saints talk about it. Father Patrick talks about it. If you're entering stage 3, you're wrong a lot. And you're still hearing voices from God that are wrong a lot. And it's really important to know that. That humility gained in stage 2 needs to be really clung to. Because there's a spiritual pride that can enter in stage 3 because you're so reformed from how you were. I mean, it's just so easy to look back and say, man, I am so much better than I was. It's ridiculous. And so you're only comparing yourself to what you were, and you always come out looking shiny. We have to be comparing ourselves to Christ and to the great saints, and then we look really dim again. Well, what's the dim? Well, it's attachment to self and pride and ego. Well, does that influence what we think we hear from God? It absolutely does. Of course it does. It influences every level of our interactions. And we have to know that we're still completely so far from God. It's very important to know that. So that humility that is learned in stage 2, because stage 2 is like all about humility and surrender. A deep humility that's deeply mistrustful of self. It needs to be remembered in the next stages, or new distractions and diversions can take over that keep one from coming into union and cause one to make lots of mistakes. So that's really stage 3. And again, I'll just say Teresa of Avila said a lot of people are in that stage. I know that I've met a lot of people in that stage. I can recognize that stage in people, and they've done a lot of work. They're not, they're just, they've done a lot of work. But there's so much further for us to go that we all have to keep in mind that there's so much further to go that what we've done amounts to nothing much at all. It looks like so much to us, and it is, but also it's nothing because there's so much further to go. And humility is the way to that further. And so canonizing our spiritual experiences at this stage, really dangerous. Everything has to be taken with a grain of salt. Everything has to be viewed with mistrust. We just don't know if it's authentic. Could be the devil. Could be the devil trying to come back. They say, Teresa of Avila talks about the devil a lot, and she talks about how the devil will withdraw until an opportune time. So let's say it's tripping somebody up with a certain kind of character defect at stage 1, and they go into stage 2, and the devil can see, whoa, they're really serious about letting this go. So the devil just backs off, lets them go completely. They go through stage 2, doing their work for real. They're really doing it. Because we have a deep respect for people who get through stage 2. It's no joke at all. So, but the devil just eases up. And then right on the other side of stage 2, it just comes back. He comes right back with the same story, but a different look. Just a different look, same story. And I think the Dalai Lama said something like that, like you have ego and then you get spiritual and you have spiritual ego. And Teresa said people in stage 3 have a lot of spiritual ego, and they've come so far, and most of the people they meet are not where they are, and so that just feeds the ego more, and that's death for enlightenment. So those are the concerns with stage 3, and like Teresa said, just don't stop there, just move on. And how do you do that? Well, the main thing you do is you up your prayer and meditation time. Right? You start to, it's like sacrifice, right? You would like to hang out all day and not go meditate again. You've already done what's required of you, but you say, you know what, I'm going to start doing more than is required of me. I don't choose the world. I choose God. And I'm hanging out on this stage because there's people in my community that are in this stage, and it's really important. It's like, if you want to go to 4, then you have to prioritize your time spent with God over your time in the world. You can do both, but one's first and one is more. And for me, it's a lull. Let's say it's a lull in the afternoon, and I'm really feeling good that day. I don't feel tired. I don't need rest, but everything mellows out in the home, and it's an opportune moment for me. I could easily go down and spend an hour in prayer, or I could hang out. But the family doesn't need it. It's not like I'm not trying to get out of my duties in this example, but they don't need me right now. I've spent quality time. For me to disappear for an hour right now would not harm anybody. Well, if you're going to get out of stage 3 to stage 4, you go and spend that time. And you don't let that part of you that just would rather not be bothered with it to ruin it for you. Okay. So I just want to really emphasize that we, because in our community, there's people, coming in the night and some starting to come out a little bit, and good, that's so good. But the jury's out on whether you go further. And, the jury's out. And also the jury's out on whether you've learned enough humility not to repeat the mistakes of your stage 1 and before you enter the castle mistakes on a more refined level, but the same thing. So there's all that. This is turning out to be a really long video. I hope that's okay. You could just pause it, I guess, and watch the rest. We're 50 minutes in, and we're about maybe only halfway through. So the fourth, so those stages are described as purgative stages, and Teresa kind of wanted to rush through them. She just couldn't wait to talk about 4, 5, 6, and 7. And she called those the supernatural stages. And Christianity in many ways will describe it as so God, in the first 3 stages, you're doing more of the work. And in the last 3 stages, God is. And that would hit our community a little different. I don't think that would land very well with our community because of the way in which I was guided through the first 3 stages. I was guided through the first 3 stages without the use of a whole lot of trying. The Holy Spirit and also Father Patrick, I was hardly ever given any assignments of any kind. You go to Father Patrick and say, I'm struggling with this disorder. I won't quit watching TV at night. And, he would say, well, do you want to try just not watching TV on Friday only? And I'd think, Friday? Come on, man. I know you're a monk, but get with reality. I can't give up Friday. But for him, Friday is this holy day. But then, I would try it and it wouldn't work. And I'd say, it just doesn't work. I can't. I could say won't watch it Friday, but I probably will, but I might not Wednesday. And so what we kind of came to is just don't try very much, but hold that willingness to walk away from that, activity. That isn't a bad activity, by the way, but it just maybe isn't the best use of your time. So in our community, we really do rely on the Holy Spirit in a supernatural way to bring us through the first 3 stages. It is God's power that's doing it. We can only remain open to God's power and willing, and then God does the healing and the changing. And that's our primary approach. And then secondarily, we say, if you could walk away from eating cookies, then stop. Of course you should if you can. But if you can't, then let God get you to a place where you can. And so I see the first 3 stages as completely supernatural. And when I ask people that are in those stages, if I ask the right questions, it seems that most people do too. Most people can sense God's power. There is a power being shined on them in those purgative stages that is healing their life. And it's subtle. It's not flashy. It's not brilliant, but it is there nonetheless. They're aware of God's presence doing something in them. It's very subtle, but it is there. So I think the first 3 stages are supernatural. I think they're entirely the activity of God. I think that the newer we are and the more immature that we are, the harder we try to make it happen ourselves. But I just haven't seen that work for people. The people who are the most willful, who are the most capable of accomplishing things in the world, seem to struggle the most in these stages because it's really about getting into God's power. It's not so much about, it's like, yes, stop swearing, but if you just stop swearing through your own efforts completely, you haven't grown any closer to God at all. You've just stopped swearing, and that's great, but you're not closer to God, so it doesn't matter. I mean, the Pharisees of Jesus's time didn't sin. I mean, not in the rigid, they didn't do the things you're not supposed to do. They didn't. But they were filled with pride about that. And so Jesus said, the outside of the cup is clean, but the inside is full of dead men's bones, right? So it's like you can be outwardly clean and inwardly really messed up. So just giving up swearing or, accomplishing some, you're very healthy now, which I think is great. But if you do it through your own power, you have gained very little or nothing on the spiritual path. And if your doing it makes you proud, you've lost ground. And so really it has to be God that accomplishes this work in us, especially the second stage. It's such a delicate stage, and there's so much very refined healing that must take place in the second stage in order for a soul to come out the right way, right? Broken in the right way, humbled in the right way, secure in the right ways. It is such a delicate process that only God could do it well. And if someone tried to do it on their own power, it would be a real loss. Okay, so what I think I'm going to do is stop here and do another video on the other stages, because this is like almost a full hour. So I think I'll just stop the video here and I'll call this Teresa of Avila Interior Castle Stage 1 through 3. And then if anything wasn't clear, just make sure you guys, if you want, you can email me, but you also could write in the comment section below the video. You can ask for some refining understanding or clarity, and then I could include that in the next video. Okay, thanks everyone very much. I appreciate all your support on every level. I've received letters of thanks, and I want you to know, for those people who've written those, I'm humbled and very grateful and touched by that. I can feel you, and I love that we have this spiritual connection. And I hope you feel it too. I think it's so neat. I knew a priest. There was a priest that trained me intellectually. I mean, I don't mean official training, but I hooked on to him, and I'd go to his house and we'd drink tea and we spend hours talking about theology. And he was really intelligent, and he had 3 master's degrees, and he was just wonderful, just, really life-changing in a lot of ways for me. And he was just a wonderful guy. And one of the things he said was that he was talking about Catholics. I'm not really representing the Catholic Church in any way, and I'm not preaching Catholicism. But he said we absolutely do not need to hold hands in order to feel our connection with one another. Our connection is universal, and it is spiritual. And he encouraged me to notice that there is a connection there that is not about physical touch or even meeting in person. And so I'm noticing some of the letters I've gotten, it's like I feel those people. I feel a connection to those people, and I know you do too. And I'm just really grateful to everybody for the support that you're giving me and the support you're giving this work. And I hope you consider yourselves a part of the community. And maybe when the virus changes, when things change, and it seems like a good idea for us to meet in person, I hope some of you will come. But nevertheless, here is this connection we're feeling now together with one another in the Holy Spirit. And listen for that and notice that, right? God is with you. You're connected to God, and I'm connected to God. And all these other people are connected to God. So we're connected to one another through God. And for me, just even in this moment talking about it, I can feel the Holy Spirit. I can feel that. I'm aware of that connection to everybody. And I hope you are too. And here we are, one with one another in the Holy Spirit, one with one another. Communing with one another spiritually in the Holy Spirit. And how lucky we are to know that. Thanks everyone so much.